Welcome to Jeopardy! I'm your host, Megan. The theme for tonight is glycolysis. I'll be asking some of our contestants some questions, so play along at home.
So glycolysis is split into two phases. The first one of these is the energy input phase, where the structure of glucose is rearranged and then two phosphate groups are attached to it, and it consumes 2 ATP in the process. And then the second stage is the energy payoff, where it produces pyruvate and then makes 2 ATP molecules and 1 NADH. And then this process happens twice to make 4 ATP and 2 NADH total.
The process of glycolysis was discovered by 3 German scientists, Edward Buchner, Gustav Emden, and Otto Meyerhof. Buchner in the 1890s performed experiments with yeast that showed the enzymatic conversion of glucose to ethanol in glycolysis. Meyerhof in the 1920s connected various steps of glycolysis by extracting enzymes from muscle tissues and attempting to stimulate the pathway. Emden in the 1930s introduced a detailed account of the steps of glycolysis, using information shown by scientists who preceded him. Purpose for 600. These are produced by glycolysis.
2 NADH, 2 ATP, and 2 pyruvate molecules.
Correct!
First is the energy input stage.
In the first step of glycolysis, glucose is phosphorylated into glucose 6-phosphate, which uses ATP and is facilitated by the enzyme hexokinase. In the second step, glucose 6-phosphate is turned into fructose 6-phosphate with the enzyme phosphoglucose isomerase. In the third step, the fructose 6-phosphate is phosphorylated into fructose 1,6-biphosphate, which takes more ATP investment and is facilitated by the enzyme phosphofructokinase. In the fourth step, the enzyme fructose biphosphate adalase separates the 1,6-biphosphate into dihydroacetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is also known as G3P. In the fifth step, an isomerase turns the dihydrophosphate into more G3P, and so now there's 2, so all the next reactions happen twice. Now we have the energy payoff phase.
In the sixth step, dehydrogenase reduces NAD plus and turns it into NADH. And it adds another phosphate group to create 1,3-biphosphoglycerate molecules. In the seventh step, 1-biphosphoglycerate gives up a phosphate to ADP to turn it into ATP, which is the energy payoff. This leaves a 3-phosphoglycerate. In the eighth step, a mutase moves the phosphate group from the third carbon to the second carbon. This turns the 3-phosphoglycerate into the 2-phosphoglycerate. In the ninth step, enolase catalyzes a dehydration reaction to create phosphoenolpyruvate. In the 10th step, pyruvate kinase dephosphorylates a phosphate group from the phosphoenolpyruvate to create an ATP and a pyruvate. But remember, this is happening twice because there were 2 G3Ps. So what happens next?
Components for 200. This sugar is consumed by glycolysis.
Glucose.
And what's the chemical formula?
C6H12O6.
Correct! Purpose for 1200. Glycolysis is this number step in cellular respiration.
Glycolysis is the first step in cellular respiration.
Correct!
So what happens next? The next steps of cellular respiration are the citric acid cycle and the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain, in which NADH, which was produced from glycolysis, is used as an electron carrier and carries the electrons to the electron transport chain, which gives off energy in the form of ATP.
So some important things to know about glycolysis is it's an anaerobic process which doesn't use oxygen. It locks energy into pyruvate, which is then used for the Krebs cycle. It occurs in the cytoplasm, and an allosteric enzyme is phosphofructokinase, which stops glycolysis from happening when the cell has too much ATP.
Purpose for 1200. This molecule is not required for glycolysis.
Oxygen, making it anaerobic.
Correct! Purpose for 1200. The first step of glycolysis turns glucose 6-phosphate into this.
What is pyruvate?
Stages for 200. This is the first stage of glycolysis.
What is the energy investment phase?
If ATP is present in the cell in large quantities, it alters the conformation of that enzyme, and thus it halts glycolysis. And this is an example of how the cell alters ATP production through allosteric regulation.
Purpose for 1200. Purpose for 1200. Glycolysis is this number step in cellular respiration.
Glycolysis is the first step in cellular respiration.
Correct.
Oxygen making it anaerobic.
Correct.
So this is obviously a very complex process, so we wanted to provide a simplified version of it so it's easier to understand. So glucose has 6 carbons, and through a hydrolysis reaction, it converts into 2 pyruvate molecules, which each have 3 carbon. And in the process of this hydrolysis reaction, ADP is phosphorylated, gains phosphate, and turns into 2 ATP molecules. And simultaneously, 2 NAD- molecules gain hydrogens from this glucose and turn into 2 NADH molecules.